The night sky over the Solomon Islands hung thick and black, untouched by moon or star on the evening of November 13, 1942. The tropical air sat heavy with moisture, clinging to skin and steel alike, as the waters of Iron Bottom Sound churned restlessly beneath the hulls of warships preparing for battle. Aboard the Japanese battleship Hiei, lookouts strained their eyes against the darkness, searching for the silhouettes of American vessels they knew lurked somewhere in those treacherous waters. The smell of oil and cordite already hung in the air, a bitter reminder of battles recently fought. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Or was it the sound of naval guns beginning their deadly conversation? For centuries, navies had known one immutable truth. When darkness fell, the guns fell silent, and aircraft returned to their carriers. Night belonged to the sea alone, to the patient vigil of destroyers and the blind searching of torpedoes. But on this night, and on countless nights to follow in the bitter struggle for the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy would confront a reality that shattered every assumption they held about naval warfare, about American capabilities, about the very nature of war itself. The Japanese sailors who gathered on deck watches that November evening represented the finest maritime tradition in Asia. They were heirs to a navy that had humbled the Russian Empire at Tsushima, that had struck with devastating precision at Pearl Harbor, that had swept across the Pacific with a speed and ferocity that left the Western powers reeling. These men had been raised on stories of Yamato Damashii, the spirit of old Japan, and trained in tactics that emphasized speed, aggression, and the decisive engagement. They had mastered night battle techniques that made them the most feared surface combatants in the world, capable of coordinating torpedo attacks in complete darkness with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to their adversaries. Their long lance torpedoes were the most advanced in the world, their optical equipment superior, their doctrine refined through years of intensive training. When night fell, Japanese commanders felt a surge of confidence, knowing that darkness transformed the Pacific into their private hunting ground. The Americans, they believed, would retreat or anchor or mill about in confusion. This was the natural order of things. This was how naval warfare had always been conducted. This was certainty itself, but certainty is a fragile thing, especially in war. And on this night, something happened that would plant the first seeds of doubt in minds previously untroubled by questions. As the Hiei and her sister ships maneuvered for what they expected to be another night surface action, as lookouts focused on the horizon searching for enemy vessels, a sound reached their ears that seemed impossible, almost supernatural. It was the drone of aircraft engines, multiple engines growing steadily louder. The first reaction was confusion. American carrier aircraft attacking at night. Impossible, suicidal. The Americans were barely competent during daylight operations. Their pilots were adequate but not exceptional, their torpedoes notoriously defective, their coordination often ragged. The idea that they would attempt complex carrier operations in complete darkness struck the Japanese commanders as absurd. Perhaps these were land-based aircraft from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, making one of their desperate nuisance raids. But Henderson was under constant bombardment, its facilities primitive, its pilots exhausted. Whatever was approaching, it could not possibly represent a serious threat. Then the first illumination flares ignited, hanging in the sky like malevolent stars, casting an eerie silver light across the dark waters. The battleship Hiei, all 36,000 tons of her, was suddenly exposed, her graceful lines and massive gun turrets rendered in harsh relief. And in that terrible moment of revelation, the Japanese lookouts saw them, not land-based bombers in ragged formation, but carrier aircraft, TBF Avengers, approaching with a coordination and precision that seemed to mock every assumption about American capabilities. The planes came in from multiple vectors, their pilots clearly able to see and communicate despite the darkness. Their attack runs methodical and professional. Some carried torpedoes, others bombs. All seemed to know exactly where to strike. The Hiei's anti-aircraft batteries opened up, tracers arcing into the night sky, but the gunners were firing blind, their carefully calculated daytime firing solutions useless in this strange half-light created by the flares. Explosions walked across the battleship's superstructure as bombs found their marks. Near misses from torpedoes sent columns of water cascading across her decks. And through it all, the drone of those engines continued. Wave after wave, aircraft that should have been safely tucked away on carrier decks somewhere, waiting for dawn to make operations possible again. What the Japanese sailors witnessed that night, and what they would witness again and again in the months and years to come, was not merely a tactical innovation, but a manifestation of industrial and organizational capability that existed on a scale they had not thought possible. The Americans were not simply flying at night. They were conducting complex multi-aircraft carrier operations in complete darkness, coordinating strikes, navigating back to ships blacked out against submarine attack, landing on pitching decks with only the most primitive of visual aids. This was not desperation or luck. This was systematic, repeatable, and improving with every operation. The Japanese had assumed that technological and tactical parity, perhaps even superiority, would characterize the Pacific War. They possessed superior torpedoes, superior optical equipment, superior night fighting doctrine. But what they faced in the darkness above the Solomon Islands was something that did not rely primarily on the quality of individual equipment or the bravery of individual men. What they faced was a system, a comprehensive approach to warfare that integrated technology, training, logistics, and doctrine in ways that multiplied effectiveness far beyond what any single innovation could achieve. To understand the magnitude of what was unfolding, one must step back from that November night and examine the fundamentally different approaches to naval aviation that characterized the American and Japanese forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy had pioneered carrier aviation, and by 1941 possessed arguably the finest carrier pilots in the world. These men underwent training regimens so intensive that only a tiny fraction survived to become operational aviators. They could perform aerobatic maneuvers that left American pilots speechless, could land on carrier decks in conditions that U.S. Navy regulations prohibited operations, could navigate across vast stretches of ocean with minimal instruments. They were in every sense an elite, carefully selected, ruthlessly trained, irreplaceable. The Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized the decisive engagement, the single massive strike that would cripple the enemy fleet. Their pilots were expected to sink ships during daylight, in good weather, using tactics they had practiced endlessly. Night operations were considered the domain of surface forces, battleships and cruisers and destroyers that would close with the enemy and fight the kind of gunnery and torpedo actions that Japanese doctrine had elevated to an art form. The American approach, by contrast, seemed almost pedestrian to observers in 1941. U.S. Navy pilots underwent shorter training periods, learning good but not exceptional flying skills, adequate but not remarkable navigation, competent but not virtuoso combat techniques. What struck Japanese intelligence analysts who studied American pilot training was how ordinary it seemed, how focused on producing large numbers of merely competent aviators rather than small numbers of true masters. This appeared to confirm Japanese assumptions about American character, that the United States was a nation of mediocrity, capable of mass production but not excellence, comfortable with adequacy but incapable of the spiritual and physical perfection that Japanese training sought to instill. What these analysts failed to grasp was that the American training system was designed not to produce irreplaceable elites, but to create a steady stream of pilots who could absorb new techniques, adapt to changing circumstances, and most importantly, train others. The Japanese system created artisans. The American system created teachers and students who could themselves become teachers. This fundamental difference in philosophy extended to every aspect of carrier aviation. When a Japanese pilot mastered a technique, it became his personal skill, honed through practice but rarely systematized in a way that could be easily transmitted to others. When an American pilot or squadron developed an effective tactic, it was documented, analyzed, incorporated into training curricula, and disseminated throughout the fleet through a remarkable system of bulletins, tactics boards, and regular rotation of combat-experienced pilots back to training commands. The Japanese Navy guarded its tactical knowledge jealously, sharing it only among elite units and experienced pilots. The American Navy treated tactical knowledge as a corporate asset, to be spread as widely and quickly as possible. This meant that innovations developed by one squadron in the South Pacific might be known and practiced by training squadrons in San Diego within weeks, and operational with every carrier in the fleet within months. Nowhere did this systematic approach to knowledge sharing become more critical than in the development of night carrier operations. The ability to launch and recover aircraft in darkness had been explored sporadically by various navies throughout the 1930s, but always as an experimental capability, something specialists might attempt in ideal conditions, but not a routine operational skill. The risks seemed to outweigh the benefits. Landing an aircraft on a carrier deck in daylight required split-second timing, precise speed control, and a healthy dose of courage. The deck was moving in 3 dimensions, pitching with the waves, rolling with the sea state, the ship itself turning and changing speed. The aircraft was low on fuel, often damaged, the pilot exhausted from combat. Adding darkness to this equation appeared to be inviting disaster. Better to keep night operations to the surface fleet, where Japanese training and equipment gave them a decided advantage. But the grinding campaign for Guadalcanal changed every calculation about acceptable risk and necessary capability. The island and its crucial airfield, Henderson Field, became the focal point of a struggle that neither side could afford to lose. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal represented the outer perimeter of their defensive sphere, the tripwire that would give them warning of American attacks, and the forward base from which they could maintain pressure on Australia and the South Pacific supply lines. For the Americans, it was the first step in the long island-hopping campaign that would eventually carry them to Tokyo, and more immediately, it was a test of whether they could sustain offensive operations in the face of Japanese resistance. The campaign quickly settled into a brutal pattern. Americans held Henderson Field and controlled the waters around Guadalcanal during daylight, when their land-based aircraft could provide cover. The Japanese owned the night, sending fast cruiser and destroyer forces down the slot, the passage through the Solomon Islands, to bombard Henderson Field and land reinforcements, then withdrawing before dawn could expose them to air attack. This nocturnal reinforcement route became known to the Americans as the Tokyo Express, and to the Japanese as the Rat Run, and it represented both sides' assumptions about night warfare perfectly. The Japanese operated at night, because that was when their superior training and equipment gave them the advantage. The Americans did not contest these runs more aggressively because nighttime naval aviation was, in their doctrine and training, essentially impossible. Both sides accepted this division of the day as a natural fact of warfare, but acceptance of such facts had never been an American military strong suit, and the cost of ceding every night to Japanese operations was becoming unbearable. Henderson Field was shelled into cratered ruins so regularly that the Marines stationed there could set their watches by the arrival of Japanese warships. American supplies piled up on transports that couldn't unload because they had to withdraw at dusk or face destruction. Most critically, the Japanese were gradually reinforcing their ground forces on the island, building toward a strength that could overwhelm the American garrison. Something had to change, and that change came not from a single brilliant innovation, but from the methodical American approach to solving problems through systematic experimentation and rapid dissemination of results. In squadron-ready rooms and carrier wardrooms, pilots and air group commanders began discussing what would be required to operate at night. The challenges were daunting. Navigation to and from targets in complete darkness required either exceptional natural navigation ability, the kind that only a fraction of pilots possessed, or better instruments and navigation aids. The Navy began equipping aircraft with improved radio direction finders and developing beacon systems that carriers could activate to help guide aircraft home. Finding targets at night demanded either brilliant moonlight, which was rare and unreliable, or artificial illumination. Experiments began with different types of flares, illumination bombs, and coordinated tactics where one aircraft would drop flares while others attacked in the brief window of visibility. Landing on a carrier at night required that the pilot be able to see the deck without making the ship visible to enemy submarines or surface forces. Engineers developed systems of carefully shielded lights that would be invisible beyond a short distance, but would give pilots enough visual reference to make the terrifying transition from flight to deck. Each of these challenges was tackled not by individual genius, but by committees, by working groups, by test pilots and operational pilots and engineers pooling their expertise. Solutions that worked were written up and distributed. Solutions that failed were analyzed to understand why. The process was messy, unromantic, intensely practical. While Japanese training manuals remained virtually unchanged from the start of the war, American doctrine was evolving monthly, incorporating lessons from every combat action, every experiment, every near disaster that provided insights into what worked and what killed people. The first attempts at night carrier operations were tentative, limited, often unsuccessful. Pilots got lost and had to ditch when they couldn't find their carriers in the darkness. Landing accidents damaged aircraft and sometimes killed men. But each failure yielded data, and data yielded improvements, and improvements became standard procedure with a speed that the more tradition-bound Japanese system could not match. By November 1942, the Enterprise and other American carriers in the South Pacific had developed night air groups, squadrons specifically trained and equipped for nocturnal operations. These men were not superhuman pilots with exceptional natural abilities. They were ordinary American aviators, products of the standard training pipeline, who had been given additional instruction in night flying techniques, equipped with better instruments, and provided with systematic procedures for everything from pre-flight briefings to post-mission debriefing. They practiced until night launches became routine, until navigation in darkness was a matter of following procedures rather than relying on intuition, until night landings were merely very difficult rather than suicidal. The Japanese naval intelligence officers who monitored American radio traffic noted the increased nighttime flight operations, but interpreted them as further evidence of American desperation. Only a force on the edge of defeat would be reckless enough to attempt such dangerous operations. What they failed to recognize was that the Americans weren't being reckless. They were being systematic, and there is nothing in warfare more dangerous than a systematic enemy. The shock that Japanese sailors experienced when American carrier aircraft appeared in the darkness above them was not merely tactical surprise, but philosophical disruption. Everything they understood about naval warfare, about the proper conduct of operations, about the natural limits of American capability, was suddenly called into question. If the Americans could operate carrier aircraft at night, what other assumptions might prove false? If they could develop this capability in mere months, what might they achieve in a year or 2 years? The Japanese Navy had always prided itself on its warrior spirit, its willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of victory, its emphasis on offensive action regardless of risk. But the American night operations represented something different from courage or aggressive spirit. They represented industrial civilization turning its full attention to a problem, and solving it through organization, training, and technology rather than through individual heroism. And this was only the beginning. As 1942 turned into 1943, American night carrier operations became increasingly sophisticated. The early tentative experiments gave way to routine operations, multiple carriers launching coordinated night strikes, combat air patrols maintaining station in complete darkness, search aircraft ranging hundreds of miles at night to locate Japanese forces. The Japanese could no longer assume that darkness provided sanctuary. Their Tokyo Express runs became increasingly costly as American night fighters intercepted them, as torpedo bombers found them in the darkness and launched attacks that were crude compared to Japanese torpedo techniques, but effective nonetheless. Japanese commanders began to factor night air attack into their operational planning, which meant accepting delays, dispersing forces, maintaining air defense conditions around the clock. The psychological impact was immense. The sense that the Americans were constantly watching, constantly present, that there was no time of day or night when Japanese forces could truly relax. What made this transformation particularly devastating from the Japanese perspective was that it was not balanced by corresponding improvements in their own night aviation capabilities. The Japanese did attempt to develop night carrier operations, but their system was fundamentally ill-suited to the task. Night flying required that pilots be willing to attempt operations at the edge of their skill level, accepting higher accident rates in exchange for capability development. But Japanese training had always emphasized perfection, the mastery of each skill before moving to the next. To send pilots into nighttime carrier operations before they had fully mastered the techniques felt wrong, wasteful, contrary to the entire philosophy of Japanese naval aviation. Moreover, the Japanese training pipeline was already stretched thin, struggling to replace the irreplaceable elite pilots lost in the intensive combat of 1942. There were no spare squadrons to dedicate to experimental night operations, no margins to absorb the higher accident rates that night training would inevitably entail. The few Japanese attempts at night carrier operations were characterized by the same individual excellence and systemic inadequacy that marked so much of their war effort. Individual pilots of exceptional skill could and did fly combat missions at night, achieving results through sheer ability and courage. But these remained isolated achievements rather than systematic capabilities. There was no Japanese equivalent to the American tactics bulletins, no rapid dissemination of successful techniques throughout the fleet, No rotation of experienced night pilots back to training commands to spread their knowledge. Each pilot who mastered night operations represented years of irreplaceable training, and when that pilot was lost, as pilots inevitably were in the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat, his knowledge died with him. The Americans lost pilots too, sometimes in appalling numbers, but the system that had trained those pilots continued to function, continued to improve, continued to produce new aviators who arrived at their squadrons already familiar with the latest techniques and equipment. This systemic advantage extended beyond training to the material realm as well. American industry was developing new technologies specifically to support night operations. Improved radar sets small enough to fit in aircraft, better radio navigation systems, specialized instruments that were easier to read in low-light conditions, even chemically treated canopies that reduced glare from the pilot's own instruments. Some of these innovations were brilliant breakthroughs, but most were incremental improvements, the kind of steady refinement that comes from engineers receiving constant feedback from operational users and having the industrial capacity to incorporate improvements into production runs. Japanese engineers were no less talented, and Japanese industry was capable of producing high-quality equipment. But the system for identifying needed improvements, prioritizing production, and distributing new equipment to operational units functioned far less efficiently. A Japanese pilot who identified a problem with his aircraft's night flying instruments might report it to his maintenance crew, who might pass it to the air group commander, who might eventually forward it to procurement officers in Tokyo, where it would join hundreds of other suggestions and complaints in a system that moved at the pace of peacetime bureaucracy. The Americans treated such feedback as intelligence, as actionable data that could provide immediate tactical advantage. Squadron reports flowed to fleet commanders, to the Bureau of Aeronautics, to training commands, to engineering departments, creating multiple parallel paths for information to reach decision-makers who had the authority and resources to act on it. This was not because American officers were inherently more intelligent or more committed than their Japanese counterparts, but because the American system was designed to harness collective intelligence rather than rely on individual brilliance. The Japanese system assumed that central planning by experienced officers would identify necessary improvements. The American system assumed that operational users would identify problems that planners could never anticipate. Both assumptions contained truth, but in the rapid evolution of night carrier operations, the American model proved vastly more adaptive. Consider the development of carrier deck lighting for night operations, a seemingly mundane problem that illustrated the systemic differences perfectly. Japanese carriers attempting night operations used essentially the same deck lighting they employed for twilight landings, carefully shielded lights that provided minimal illumination to avoid making the ship visible to enemy submarines. Pilots attempting to land in these conditions relied primarily on the skill they had developed through years of training, using subtle visual cues and almost supernatural situational awareness to judge their approach. It worked sometimes when the pilot was exceptionally skilled and conditions were favorable. It failed catastrophically, just often enough to discourage systematic night operations. The Japanese response was to select more talented pilots for night landing training and to restrict such operations to conditions where success was likely. A reasonable response from a system that viewed pilot skill as the primary variable in aviation safety. The American approach was characteristically different. When pilots reported difficulty judging their approach at night, the immediate response was not train harder, but what do you need to see? A working group formed, pilots, landing signal officers, electrical engineers, even psychologists specializing in visual perception. They experimented with different lighting configurations, different colors of light, different patterns. They discovered that vertical lines of light gave pilots better depth perception than horizontal lines, that certain wavelengths of red light were visible to pilots on approach, but less visible to submarines, that carefully angled lights could illuminate the landing area without blinding pilots on final approach. These discoveries were systematized into improved lighting systems that were retrofitted to carriers with remarkable speed. The improved systems reduced night landing accidents, which encouraged more night operations, which generated more data, which led to further improvements. Within a year, night landings on American carriers had gone from exceptionally dangerous to merely routine dangerous, still requiring skill and courage, but no longer demanding superhuman ability. Every aspect of night operations received this same systematic attention. Navigation procedures, formation keeping in darkness, communication protocols, target identification techniques, emergency procedures when whether closed in or aircraft were damaged. The body of accumulated knowledge grew exponentially. And because the American system was designed to share knowledge rather than hoard it, this accumulated wisdom became available to every squadron, every air group, every pilot entering the training pipeline. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with American night aircraft reported to their commanders that the Americans seemed to be getting better, not gradually, but rapidly, at a pace that suggested their pilots were benefiting from some kind of supernatural aid. In a sense, they were. They were benefiting from the accumulated experience of thousands of pilots, hundreds of engineers, dozens of tactics development groups, all feeding information into a system designed to learn and adapt at industrial scale. The symbolic power of night carrier operations extended far beyond their immediate tactical impact. For the Japanese military and civilian leadership, the appearance of American aircraft in the night sky represented the failure of a fundamental assumption that had underwritten their entire strategy for the Pacific War. That assumption was that, while America possessed greater industrial capacity than Japan, the war would be decided by spiritual and tactical factors that favored Japanese warriors. The Japanese believed that their willingness to accept casualties, their superior training and fighting spirit, their mastery of techniques like night surface combat, would offset American material advantages. They could concede that America could build more ships, produce more aircraft, train more pilots, but they believed that Japanese ships would be better designed, Japanese aircraft would be more maneuverable, Japanese pilots would be more skillful. Quality would trump quantity, spirit would overcome material. The warrior tradition would prevail over industrial mass production. Night carrier operations shattered this comforting narrative because they demonstrated that American material superiority was not a separate factor from tactical proficiency. It enabled and enhanced tactical proficiency in ways the Japanese had not anticipated. The Americans did not succeed at night operations despite their industrial approach to war. They succeeded because of it. Their ability to rapidly produce improved equipment, train large numbers of pilots to consistent standards, analyze and disseminate tactical innovations, maintain carrier task forces at sea for extended periods. All of these advantages flowed directly from industrial and organizational capabilities rather than from individual courage or skill. This was a deeply disturbing realization for Japanese leaders who had built their strategy on the assumption that the Americans would fight as other Western powers had fought, with centralized planning, rigid doctrine, and a reluctance to accept casualties. Instead, the Americans were proving oddly adaptive, willing to experiment, comfortable with decentralized decision-making, and capable of tolerating high losses while they developed effective tactics. The night sky, which had seemed a natural ally to Japanese forces, became a source of anxiety and eventually a symbol of American omnipresence. Japanese sailors on the Tokyo Express runs began to dread dusk not because darkness made navigation difficult, but because darkness might conceal American aircraft. Japanese commanders planning operations had to account for potential night air attacks, which meant dispersing forces, maintaining defensive formations, expending anti-aircraft ammunition during hours when they had previously been able to conserve it. The psychological weight of never being safe, never being unobserved, never being able to rest, accumulated over months into a pervasive exhaustion that sapped efficiency even when actual attacks did not occur. The Americans did not need to achieve devastating tactical results with every night operation. The mere fact that such operations were possible, that they occurred regularly, that they could happen at any time, achieved a strategic effect disproportionate to the actual damage inflicted. And the tactical results were often devastating. One of the most striking examples came in July 1943, during the Allied offensive against Japanese positions in New Georgia. Japanese destroyers of the Tokyo Express were attempting one of their characteristic night runs, carrying troops and supplies down the slot to reinforce garrisons under American pressure. The Japanese commander knew American ships might intercept him. That risk had always existed. But he anticipated a night surface action, the kind of combat where Japanese training and superior torpedoes gave his force a fighting chance. Instead, his destroyers were attacked by carrier aircraft, that seemed to have no difficulty operating in complete darkness. Illumination flares turned night into day, exposing his ships to torpedo attacks they could not evade and could barely see coming. The destroyers scattered, their carefully planned formation disintegrating as each captain maneuvered independently to avoid the aerial assault. When American surface forces did arrive, they found Japanese ships dispersed and disoriented, easy targets for radar-directed gunfire. It was a comprehensive defeat, but more significantly, it was a demonstration that the Americans had achieved tactical integration of air and surface forces at night, something the Japanese had believed impossible. Reports from this action and dozens like it filtered back to Tokyo, where staff officers attempted to process what they meant for Japanese strategy. Some argued for crash programs to develop equivalent night aviation capabilities, but the resources and time required made such programs impractical when the Japanese were already struggling to maintain their daylight aviation strength. Others suggested altering Japanese tactics to avoid American night air, but that meant ceding operational initiative to an enemy who could now operate around the clock. A few prescient officers recognized that night carrier operations were symptomatic of a broader American advantage in systematic innovation, and suggested that Japan's entire approach to military technology and doctrine needed fundamental reform. But such suggestions went nowhere in a system where acknowledging the need for fundamental change felt too much like admitting defeat. So the Japanese continued to fight with the doctrine and assumptions that had served them well in 1941, even as those assumptions became increasingly disconnected from the reality of 1943 and 1944. The evolution of American night operations continued relentlessly. By late 1943, specialized night fighter squadrons were operating from carriers, equipped with radar-equipped aircraft that could intercept Japanese bombers attempting dusk or dawn attacks on American task forces. These night fighters began to exact a toll on Japanese air attacks that had previously been almost impossible to defend against. The few Japanese aircraft that still managed to penetrate American defenses typically did so during the twilight hours when detection was difficult and interception uncertain. American night fighters eliminated even this narrow window of vulnerability, providing around-the-clock protection for carrier task forces that allowed those forces to operate closer to Japanese bases and maintain stations for longer periods. The strategic implications were profound. American carriers were becoming mobile airbases that could project power continuously, while Japanese land-based air had to contend with regular night attacks that prevented rest and forced defensive dispersion of forces. The development of night carrier aviation also had unexpected effects on American daytime operations. Pilots who had mastered night flying generally found themselves more capable in marginal weather conditions, more comfortable with instrument flying, more precise in their navigation. The additional training and experience made them better pilots across the board, not just at night. Squadrons that had trained for night operations developed tighter coordination and better discipline, because night flying demanded both. There was no room for the kind of loose formation flying or casual communications discipline that might be acceptable during daylight. These improvements carried over into daytime combat, where American air groups became noticeably more professional and effective over the course of 1943 and 1944. Japanese intelligence officers noted this improvement, but generally attributed it to the Americans finally learning from their mistakes, rather than recognizing it as the natural result of a system designed to continuously incorporate lessons and improve performance. The Japanese did eventually develop limited night aviation capabilities of their own, but these remained specialized, elite functions rather than systematic capabilities available throughout the fleet. Individual pilots of extraordinary skill flew night missions, often with notable success, but their achievements only highlighted the absence of broader capability. When these elite night pilots were lost, there was no ready pipeline of trained replacements, no systematized doctrine to pass on to new pilots, no organizational memory that preserved their techniques and insights. Each elite pilot effectively had to rediscover the principles of night aviation on their own, learning through trial and error lessons that American pilots absorbed during training. This meant that Japanese night aviation capability actually declined over the course of the war as irreplaceable experts were killed, while the American capability grew steadily as more pilots received systematic training in standardized techniques. By 1944, The disparity in night operations had become so pronounced that it influenced American strategic planning in fundamental ways. The island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific relied on American carrier task forces maintaining continuous pressure on Japanese bases and supporting amphibious landings against fortified positions. The ability to operate around the clock meant that American carriers could provide air cover during the critical dawn and dusk periods when Japanese air attacks were most likely, could strike Japanese airfields at night to catch aircraft on the ground, and could maintain anti-submarine patrols continuously rather than just during daylight hours. These capabilities were force multipliers in the most literal sense. They allowed the same number of carriers to generate more sorties, maintain more persistent pressure, and protect more surface forces than would have been possible with daylight operations alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of how American night capabilities had transformed the character of naval warfare. After a day of intensive air combat that saw Japanese carrier aviation virtually destroyed in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American search aircraft located the retreating Japanese fleet late in the afternoon. The sun would set before any attack could be launched, and recovery of aircraft after the attack would have to occur in complete darkness. This was exactly the kind of scenario that had been considered impossible just 2 years earlier, launching a full strike from multiple carriers, having those aircraft fight an engagement at extreme range, then recover them at night on carriers that had to maintain radio and light discipline because of submarine threat. It was risky, and multiple aircraft would be lost to accidents during night recovery, but it was possible, and the damage inflicted on the Japanese fleet justified the risks. American carriers launched, American aircraft struck and damaged several Japanese carriers and support ships, and American pilots then faced the harrowing challenge of navigating back to their carriers in complete darkness, many running low on fuel, some damaged, all exhausted. The recovery operation was chaotic, with aircraft circling in the darkness, pilots calling out their fuel states on clogged radio frequencies, landing signal officers bringing aircraft aboard in rapid succession with minimal spacing. Aircraft crashed on landing, ran into barriers, ran off deck edges. Some pilots ran out of fuel and had to ditch near their carriers, but the majority made it back. The system worked, and the strategic result, further crippling an already badly damaged Japanese carrier force, was significant. Japanese observers, monitoring American radio traffic and interrogating prisoners from downed aircraft, were stunned by what the Americans had attempted and accomplished. No Japanese carrier force could have considered such an operation, not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because the systematic training, equipment, and procedures required to make it possible simply did not exist in the Japanese system. This was not a matter of Japan being behind in some technological race. It was a matter of Japan having organized its military and industrial systems in ways that made certain kinds of capabilities almost impossible to develop even when the need was recognized. The shock that Japanese sailors first experienced in November 1942, when American carrier aircraft appeared in the night sky, evolved into a pervasive recognition by 1944 that they were fighting an enemy that was fundamentally different from what they had expected. The Americans were supposed to be soft, individualistic, undisciplined, capable of mass production but not excellence, able to absorb defeats but not to learn from them. Instead, the Japanese found themselves facing an enemy that was proving remarkably adaptive, that seemed to get stronger rather than weaker as the war continued, that could develop sophisticated capabilities with disconcerting speed, and that possessed organizational and industrial depth that allowed them to sustain operations at a tempo the Japanese could not match. The night sky, which had once been a sanctuary, had become just another battlefield where American advantages in training, technology, and organizational learning could be brought to bear. This transformation in the character of naval warfare represented something larger than military innovation. It reflected fundamentally different ideas about how societies should be organized and how problems should be solved. The Japanese system emphasized hierarchy, central planning, preservation of elite capabilities, and the primacy of spiritual factors over material ones. This approach had yielded remarkable results in the initial phase of the war, when carefully prepared forces executed meticulously planned operations against surprised and unprepared opponents. But as the war settled into a protracted struggle of adaptation and industrial mobilization, the American system proved superior. That system emphasized decentralization, rapid feedback loops, systematic problem-solving, and the harnessing of collective intelligence. Where the Japanese saw warfare as a test of national spirit and martial virtue, the Americans increasingly treated it as an engineering problem to be solved through systematic analysis and technological innovation. Neither approach was inherently superior in all contexts. Japanese methods had achieved stunning successes and would produce remarkable tactical achievements even in the final months of the war. But in the specific context of the Pacific War, a conflict that demanded rapid adaptation to new technologies and tactics, that rewarded organizational learning and systematic innovation, and that ultimately would be decided by industrial capacity sustained over years of intensive combat, the American approach proved devastatingly effective. The development of night carrier operations was emblematic of this broader pattern. An initially inferior capability that was transformed through systematic effort into a decisive advantage that the Japanese could not match or counter. The recurring symbol throughout this transformation was the sound of aircraft engines in the night, a sound that represented American presence, American persistence, American refusal to accept limitations that other navies considered natural facts of warfare. For Japanese sailors, that sound became associated with dread, with the realization that there was no longer any sanctuary from American air power, no time when Japanese forces could safely transit or resupply or rest. For American pilots, the sound of their engines returning to their carriers in darkness represented achievement, the mastery of a difficult skill through training and equipment and courage. For both sides, the sound symbolized the industrial and organizational power of a nation that could not only produce aircraft in astonishing numbers, but could develop entirely new operational capabilities while simultaneously fighting across two oceans. The human cost of this achievement was substantial, but distributed in ways that the American system could bear. Training accidents killed pilots who were learning night operations. Combat losses were higher during night missions than during comparable daylight operations, at least initially. Deck crew members died in landing accidents when exhausted pilots misjudged approaches in darkness. But these losses, while tragic for the individuals and units involved, were absorbed by a training and replacement system that continued to function, continued to improve, and continued to produce new pilots who benefited from the lessons their predecessors had learned. The Japanese, fighting with a more fragile system that could not sustain high losses while simultaneously expanding capabilities, had to choose between accepting the tactical disadvantage of ceding night operations to the Americans or accepting casualties they could not afford in pursuit of a capability they lacked the systematic infrastructure to develop. They chose, generally, to accept the tactical disadvantage, a rational decision given their constraints, but one that contributed to the steady erosion of Japanese operational effectiveness as the war progressed. By 1945, American night carrier operations had become so routine that they no longer attracted particular attention in after-action reports unless something unusual occurred. What had been impossible in 1941, experimental in 1942, and remarkable in 1943 was simply normal by 1945. Carriers launched and recovered aircraft around the clock. Night fighters maintained continuous combat air patrols. Night attack squadrons struck Japanese positions and shipping without pausing for sunset. The Japanese Navy, once the masters of night combat, had largely ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Its ships sunk or immobilized by lack of fuel, its aircraft destroyed, its pilots dead or grounded by lack of replacement aircraft and the fuel to fly them. The sky belonged to the Americans day and night, and that dominance was both cause and consequence of American victory in the Pacific. But the significance of night carrier operations extended beyond their immediate tactical and strategic impact. They represented proof of concept for a way of warfare that would come to dominate the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Warfare characterized by rapid technological evolution, systematic organizational learning, and the integration of complex systems to achieve capabilities that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. The Americans did not win the Pacific War solely or even primarily because of night carrier operations. But the development of those operations exemplified the advantages that ultimately proved decisive. Industrial capacity, not merely to produce equipment, but to continuously improve it, training systems that could scale while maintaining quality, and organizational structures that facilitated rather than hindered innovation and adaptation. The Japanese sailors who first heard American aircraft engines in the darkness above Iron Bottom Sound could not have understood the full implications of what they were witnessing. They knew it was unexpected, dangerous, evidence that the Americans were proving more capable than Japanese intelligence had assessed. But they could not have known that they were seeing the future of naval warfare, that the sound of those engines marked the obsolescence of everything they had been trained to believe about night combat, or that the systematic approach to military innovation those aircraft represented would prove impossible for Japan to match or counter. The shock of that November night was tactical, an immediate recognition that darkness no longer provided sanctuary. But the deeper shock, the one that would unfold over months and years, was strategic and even philosophical. The realization that the enemy they faced was not fighting the kind of war the Japanese had prepared for, and could not be defeated by the methods that Japanese tradition and training had emphasized. In the end, the transformation of night skies over the Pacific from sanctuaries to battlefields became a metaphor for the larger transformation of the war itself. What had begun as a conflict, the Japanese leadership believed would be decided by spiritual factors and superior fighting spirit, became a war of industrial and organizational systems, where the ability to learn, adapt, and systematically improve proved more valuable than traditional military virtues. This did not diminish the courage of individual Japanese sailors and pilots. Many fought with extraordinary bravery to the very end. But courage alone could not overcome the systemic disadvantages that became apparent once the war shifted from initial operations, executed according to prepared plans, to an extended struggle of adaptation and innovation. The Americans proved better at that struggle not because individual American soldiers or pilots were superior, but because American military, industrial, and educational systems were organized in ways that facilitated collective learning and systematic problem-solving. The sound of aircraft engines at night, that sound which had seemed impossible, which had shocked Japanese sailors in November 1942, became by 1945 simply another aspect of American air superiority, noteworthy only in its initial development. But in that transformation from impossible to routine lay a pattern that would characterize technological and military development for generations to come. The pattern of problems solved not through individual genius, but through systematic effort, of capabilities developed through institutional learning rather than elite expertise, of quantity and system proving superior to quality and spirit, not because they replaced those virtues, but because they multiplied and sustained them. The Japanese had bet on the power of the elite, the irreplaceable warrior, the perfect technique. The Americans had bet on the power of the system, the replaceable and trainable soldier, the adequate technique that could be taught and improved. In the skies over the Pacific, in the darkness where Japanese sailors had expected sanctuary, and found instead a new kind of warfare, that bet paid off in ways that shocked those who had believed spirit could overcome systems and tradition could defeat innovation. And so the night sky, that ancient symbol of mystery and danger, became something else in the Pacific War, a symbol of American industrial civilization at full mobilization, of a society that could not only produce the instruments of war in staggering numbers, but could continuously reimagine how those instruments should be used. That could transform its ordinary citizens into competent practitioners of extraordinarily difficult skills, and that could harness collective intelligence to solve problems that seemed insoluble to those who relied on traditional approaches. The Japanese sailors who witnessed the first American night carrier operations saw aircraft where aircraft should not be, heard engines when silence should have reigned, and experienced the first intimations of a defeat that would be comprehensive precisely, because it was systematic rather than dramatic, industrial rather than spiritual, a defeat administered not by heroes, but by systems that produced competent people who followed good procedures using adequate equipment that was continuously improved based on feedback from those who used it. This was not the kind of defeat Japanese military tradition had prepared them to understand or accept. Honorable defeat in combat against a superior warrior was comprehensible, even meaningful within Japanese martial culture. But defeat by industrial systems, by organizational learning, by training pipelines and technical bulletins and systematic improvement processes. This was defeat by forces that seemed almost inhuman in their relentlessness, their impersonality, their disregard for individual excellence in favor of collective competence. The American pilots who flew those night missions were not samurai, were not elites trained from childhood, were not masters of ancient warrior traditions. They were farm boys and city kids, college students and mechanics, taught to fly in a matter of months, given standard procedures to follow, equipped with instruments and radios and other technological aids that Japanese training had taught their opponents to view as crutches for the insufficiently skilled. And yet these ordinary men, following their procedures and using their instruments, proved capable of feats that Japanese elite pilots could not match, because those ordinary men were backed by systems that Japanese elites could not replicate. The epilogue to this transformation was written not in a single dramatic moment, but across hundreds of night missions, thousands of successful night landings, and the steady accumulation of tactical advantages that ultimately contributed to strategic victory. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, American carrier task forces were operating off the Japanese coast with impunity, striking targets around the clock, demonstrating a level of air-sea integration and operational tempo that no navy in history had previously achieved. The night sky above Japan itself, which had seemed inviolable to air attack just 4 years earlier, now belonged to American aircraft that ranged over Japanese cities and factories and ports without significant opposition. The shock that Japanese sailors had experienced in 1942 had become by 1945 simply the way things were. Americans owned the sky, day and night, and no Japanese effort or sacrifice or spirit could change that fundamental fact. But perhaps the most profound epilogue was not written in the Pacific at all, but in the decades that followed, as the American approach to military innovation, systematic, organizational, based on rapid feedback and continuous improvement, became the model for how advanced militaries would develop capabilities. The pattern established in the development of night carrier operations would repeat countless times in different contexts. An apparently impossible challenge addressed through systematic experimentation, innovations shared rapidly throughout the organization, adequate solutions scaled and improved rather than perfect solutions hoarded, technology and training and doctrine evolving together rather than in isolation. The Japanese approach, emphasizing elite capability and traditional methods, would increasingly seem archaic, appropriate perhaps for a different era, but inadequate for warfare in an age of rapid technological change and industrial mobilization. And so when we remember the sound of aircraft engines in the darkness above Iron Bottom Sound on that November night in 1942, we should hear not just the tactical surprise of one battle, but the echoes of a transformation in how societies organized themselves for war, how they developed and shared knowledge, and how they harnessed technology and organization to multiply human capability, rather than simply celebrating individual excellence. The Japanese sailors were stunned when American planes launched at night, because they were witnessing something that contradicted their understanding of what was possible, that challenged their assumptions about American capability, that symbolized a form of power they had not anticipated and could not easily counter. They were stunned not by an act of exceptional heroism or tactical genius, but by the systematic execution of a carefully developed procedure by adequately trained pilots using improved equipment, following doctrine that had been refined through rapid iteration and organizational learning. This was the face of modern warfare, and it was shocking precisely because it was so ordinary, so unheroic, so dependent on systems rather than on the samurai spirit that Japanese military culture had celebrated for centuries. The Americans won the night not through superior courage. Courage existed in abundance on both sides, but through superior organization, more adaptive systems, better integration of feedback loops, and an industrial and educational base that could sustain innovation while simultaneously fighting a global war. These were the advantages that ultimately proved decisive, and they were advantages that grew naturally from the character of American society. Pragmatic, individualistic yet capable of collective action, comfortable with change, willing to discard tradition when it ceased to serve practical purposes, and profoundly confident that problems could be solved through organized effort even when they seemed insoluble to those bound by conventional thinking. The night sky above the Pacific became a symbol of all these things, and the sound of American aircraft engines cutting through the darkness carried a message that Japanese sailors understood even if they could not articulate it, that they were fighting an enemy unlike any in their history, an enemy that grew stronger through combat rather than weaker, that learned faster than they could adapt, and that possessed reserves of capability that seemed bottomless because they were systematic rather than heroic. It was a message written not in words, but in the drone of engines where engines should not be, in the flash of bombs falling when darkness should have provided protection, in the steady erosion of Japanese capability and the simultaneous expansion of American power. And it was a message that, once understood, carried with it the certain knowledge of ultimate defeat, not in any single battle, but in the long, grinding struggle between industrial systems, where depth mattered more than brilliance, adaptability more than tradition, and adequate solutions that could be taught and scaled mattered more than perfect techniques that died with the masters who knew them. The stunned silence that followed those first American night attacks, the moment when Japanese sailors realized that the rules had changed in ways they did not fully understand, was the beginning of wisdom. A wisdom purchased at terrible cost, comprehended too late to alter outcomes, but real nonetheless. It was the wisdom of understanding that warfare had entered a new age, that the future belonged to systems rather than heroes, and that the sound of aircraft engines in the darkness was not an anomaly, but a harbinger of transformations yet to come. For those sailors on those ships in those dark waters, it was the sound of their assumptions crumbling, their certainties eroding, their world changing in ways that no amount of courage or skill or fighting spirit could prevent. It was the sound of the future, arriving before its scheduled time, delivered by ordinary men flying ordinary planes, using procedures developed through systematic experimentation, and shared through organizational systems that made individual excellence unnecessary, because they made collective competence possible. And in that sound, in that shocked recognition of the impossible made routine, lay a truth that would echo through the decades, that the character of modern warfare had fundamentally changed, that the future belonged not to those who fought as their ancestors had fought, but to those who could harness the full power of industrial civilization to purposes of war. And that victory in such warfare required not just courage and skill, though those remained necessary, but organizational genius, systematic innovation, and the ability to learn faster than the enemy could adapt. These were the lessons written in the night sky above the Pacific, taught by the drone of engines that should not have been there, learned at last by those who heard them and understood too late what they meant. The Americans had not just launched planes at night. They had launched a new way of war, and the shock of that realization, first experienced on one dark November evening, would reverberate until the moment when Japanese representatives signed surrender documents on the deck of an American battleship, surrounded by American might, under skies that America had conquered completely, day and night, through methods that represented not the end of warfare, but its transformation into something the previous age could scarcely have imagined.